Welcome to Gears Overdrive. I'm Dennis Madden, and I wrote an article in the July issue of Gears magazine covering the 6T40, and particularly the upgrades and changes that they made with the 456 clutch drum. Actually, I shouldn't consider it an upgrade because they aren't interchangeable, and that's a big issue out in the industry with taking first generation components and changing them to the second generation. One of the things that people are finding is the ring tower wears out, and so it's thought that since the second generation ring tower was lasting quite a bit longer, we just swap them out. And it's thought that if you change everything as a complete assembly that it works, and it does on the road test. A lot of times people will drive these cars and it works great, and they deliver them out the door, not recognizing the subtle differences in these systems that makes it not interchangeable. So let's talk about it. First generation, you'll notice, has 4 sealing rings on it. The second generation, only 3. Something a little less relevant, but worth talking about, and that is the first generation clutch pack has 4 frictions and a wave plate. The second generation, no wave plate and 5 frictions. Where you really get into the detail is in the drum itself. As you disassemble these drums, you'll notice this piston. It's called a return piston. And it's a fascinating concept. And that is, with any clutch drum, when the piston is off, there's always oil trapped behind it. Now, you may have a check ball or a bleed hole that'll get the majority of it out, but that's not always the case. They're not always engineered with that type of relief. And so, as a drum is spinning, the centrifugal force created will push the oil to the outside of the drum, and it has a tendency of pushing the piston on, and it can drag the clutches. So the answer to that is the return piston. Now, aside from the size differences, something that's really noticeable is the first generation has a seal on the inside and the outside. The second generation, however, only has a seal on the outside. So now, why would they make this difference? Well, it has to do with the valve body, which, by the way, isn't interchangeable, so don't even try it. On the first generation, what they did was they supplied a very low pressure behind this return piston. And the idea behind it is when the drum spins up and you have the centrifugal force behind the apply piston, to put some oil behind the return piston to overcome that force. So you've got oil on both sides of the apply piston. It's a great idea. And it keeps them from having to mess around with stronger springs or any of the other dynamics that could influence the shift feel. But now when you get to the second generation, notice that there is not an inner seal, which means that you can't pressurize it. All right? First generation is pressurized. The second generation is not. All they do is they dribble oil behind it just to make sure that there's some presence of oil at the piston. It also works great. Now, what happens when you swap the two? Now, all of a sudden, you've got a drum that is not contained, or I should say a piston that is not contained, that's being fed by a regulator. Well, what happens with a regulator when you open the regulation passage is it just opens up and starts flowing oil. So when you trade this out, when you change this, or you think that you're considering this as an upgrade, what's actually happening is you've just put a giant hole into the mainline pressure tap, or the mainline source. So while this thing is operating, it's just leaking oil right out of the pump, and you may not notice it on the road test. It may take some miles before you begin to get some shift characteristics like falling out of gear. You may have some immediate differences in shift feel, but you will certainly have a low line pressure condition, and it makes it an unsuitable swap. So let's keep these two parts together. Keep first generation with first generation, second generation with second generation, and all is well. Thanks again for tuning in to Gears Overdrive, and I'd like to offer a special thanks to Dalen Hester from Whatever It Takes Transmissions for supplying these parts for this research project. See you next time.